College in Annandale-on-Hudson, New York, in the Hudson River Valley. His research has focused on Russian and German history, communism, and the First and Second World Wars. He is the author of 8 books, along with scholarly articles that have been in very scholarly journals that I won't go into. But the one journal a lot more of us have read is the Wall Street Journal. And he says his article in the Wall Street Journal got him in trouble with the Russian government, probably because he told the truth. So, if you got your copy of Stalin's War with you, here, as soon as he's done, I'm sure our Dr. McMeekin will be happy to sign it. If not, after we're done, back in the museum, we've got more copies of his book for $25 each. He'll be happy to sign them for you. Those of you who are interested in learning more about what he's going to tell us today. His book, Stalin's War, A New History of World War II. Most World War II histories center on Hitler, but his book shows the vast influence Stalin had on the war, had on Roosevelt, and on post-war Europe. And Stalin's Russia benefited greatly from Lend-Lease aid from, guess who? United States of America, and helped Stalin to dominate and control vast areas of Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain after World War II. So without further ado, Dr. Sean McMeekin, let's welcome him, please.
Thank you, Mike, for a very kind introduction, and thank you, Ken, and thanks to the sponsors, and also the Veterans History Museum, which I was very pleased to visit this morning. It's a wonderful facility. But Mike brought up a painful recent history with my piece in the Wall Street Journal. It's almost become a bit wistful. I mean, on the one hand, there's a certain honor of being personally denounced by the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 4th of July, no less. It was actually last year on the 4th of July, right after the tweet where they congratulated Americans on their national holiday. There was a denunciation of Comrade McMeekin. Thing I wrote in the Wall Street. I'll talk a little more about what got me in trouble specifically once we get to the subject matter. But it's a little bit wistful in a way thinking about this. I was actually talking to another Mike here, Mike Shelley, over lunch, who had a hand in organizing the Revelations from the Russian Archives exhibit at the Library of Congress back in 1992, so that's now 30 years ago. And it was an exhibit which actually inspired my very first research project, which really kind of kick-started my career, and to some extent the leitmotif of most of those 8 books you heard about ever since has been, to some extent, Revelations from the Russian Archives. I mean, it's to some extent, I like to think I'm more than a one-trick pony, but it's not a bad trick. That is, you go into these archives which were previously closed, and there are these hidden treasures and secrets, and you can discover and reinterpret events. I've done this for the First World War. My editors tend to get in a bit of trouble with the titles. So when I did this for the First World War, my own title was Russia's Aims in the First World War, which is fairly neutral and descriptive, and Harvard University Press wanted to sex it up. You know, they wanted to sell books, believe it or not, and so they came up with the Russian origins of the First World War to make it sound like I was blaming Russia for the war. And of course, that got me in lots of trouble with reviewers, but it did help to sell the book. They did the same thing with this one, by the way, A New History of World War II. This of course, raises the question, am I blaming Stalin for the entire war? Well, editors like to do this, and I understand, I suppose, why they like to do it, and I think I go along with it. But that's not really exactly where I'm coming from. What I'm trying to do when I go to the archives is to rediscover these subjects, or you might say, reinterpret them in light of information which previously had been unavailable. Some of which actually has to do with this picture here, which has, believe it or not, a connection to that museum, but I'm going to leave that dangling for now. I think we'll kind of start and end with that. Now, to begin with, there's a lot about the Second World War that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it a little bit more critically. To begin with, we're often told the war was about Poland. It began in Poland. There's actually a joke they told in Britain after the war when Churchill was, I think, attending an event at London Theatre, and he was up in the loge in the box, and then someone pointed out, and they said, "Oh, look at all of this. This scene of normalcy after all the carnage. Isn't this what we were fighting for?" And so a wit who was sitting nearby said, "Why? Are they all Poles?" Weren't we supposed to be fighting about Poland? Well, the war was supposed to be about Poland. So the war begins over Poland. Britain and France supposedly declare war over Poland in September 1939, and then they don't do anything for Poland. They don't invade Germany. They don't offer air support. They don't even send javelins and stingers. That is to say, that even military aid was effectively out of the question. Britain didn't even send loans. This is kind of astonishing when you think about it. Now, admittedly, Britain was hard-strapped to begin with. And part of the story of Lend-Lease and where it came from, and I'll get to Lend-Lease in a moment, is, of course, that Britain was effectively in default on her World War I debts to this country, which Britain never paid. We actually passed something called the Johnson Act in 1934, making it illegal for most American banks to lend money, certainly banks that have government affiliation, to countries in default, which included the Soviet Union, also included Great Britain. So part of the reason the British were so hard up, and yes, they were a little bit, shall we say, stingy with the Poles, is that they couldn't even really import many arms from the United States because they couldn't really borrow money here. Eventually, they had to ship over most of their gold reserves, which ended up in Fort Knox, part of the unmistakable transfer of power from Britain to the United States. But so back to Poland. So Britain and France didn't really help Poland. Britain dropped a couple of bombs on the German coastline, kind of half-heartedly. They didn't really hit anything. French troops very briefly, almost in a kind of theatrical maneuver, crossed the German frontier at Saarbrücken, and then they went back. So they didn't actually do anything. So after about 8 or 9 months, as we know, there is a war in Western Europe, but the rest of it, you might have heard this phrase, the phony war, the drôle de guerre. The Germans called it more evocatively the Sitzkrieg, the sitting on my butt war. So they declare war on behalf of Poland. They don't fight for Poland. They allow Poland to be crushed. And at the end of the war, Poland ends up under Soviet occupation. So the war was fought for Poland. Poland never received reparations. Poland was jointly invaded by Germany and the Soviet Union in September 1939, has never received a kopeck or a pfennig of reparations from either Germany or Russia. Several years ago, Poland actually applied once again to the Chancellor's office when Angela Merkel was still in power and was told that, no, we're sorry. Poland forfeited her right to reparations in 1953, when Poland was, of course, an occupied Soviet satellite state. No longer for Poland. Well, that's kind of curious. You know, another thing you often hear about the war is that there is a failure of collective security. And what you often hear in the diplomatic histories is that it's because of this kind of irrational anti-communist prejudice in the West. You see, Britain and France, they didn't trust Stalin. They didn't trust the Soviets, and that's why they never really agreed on a genuine mutual assistance pact or a defensive treaty, like the one they had with Poland. As we know, that all worked out really well for Poland. But so, the Soviet Union, so Czechoslovakia, you probably know the story of Munich, 1938, the traditional story about Chamberlain and appeasement and all the rest of it. But I was rather curious. Supposedly, that is, the Soviets were supposed to come to the aid of Czechoslovakia and then later Poland against Germany. A couple of problems here. One, you can see in this map, that's supposed to be a smaller circle. This was kind of an error in editing, but I'll try to point out. Basically, we're looking at this area here. You can't quite see it because the circle is too large. The pointed issue here is that the Soviet Union did not border Czechoslovakia. So, for the Soviet Union to offer any aid to Czechoslovakia, if the Soviet Union had wished to do so, which of course it did not, they would have had to invade either Poland or Romania first. Now, the same thing was true, of course, if they had signed a pact with Britain and France, again, which they didn't actually want to do. There's no evidence they did, even though historians will continue to say this. There's a historian called Geoffrey Roberts. He's one of the few Stalinists left outside Russia. He teaches in Ireland. Anyway, I've tussled with him from time to time over questions like this. And he insists that all along Stalin desperately wanted a collective security anti-fascist agreement against Hitler. And he was, of course, failed because of this kind of prejudice. Well, a couple of problems with this. You know, first of all, to do anything against Germany, as you can see here, the Soviets would have had to invade Poland or Romania. Interestingly, when British and French envoys went on a last-minute, last-ditch mission to Russia, to Moscow in August 1939, they actually discussed this, and Stalin's kind of hack crony defense commissar, Klim Voroshilov, he kept, just basically saying as bluntly as possible. He was actually kind of having fun because he knew Stalin was about to sign a deal with Hitler, and he just sort of like torturing these poor French and British envoys. You know, it says like, so, well, have you received permission now from Poland and Romania for us to invade their countries? And no, the answer is no, we haven't received that permission, but surely if Germany invaded them, they would probably consent to have the Red Army invade. And Roosevelt says, oh, are you so sure? Perhaps you should ask them. Now, the French were game. They actually they sent an envoy to Warsaw, and they asked the Poles, would you be willing to be invaded by the Red Army? And the answer was no. Okay? So they didn't have permission, which effectively meant no deal. There were a lot of other reasons why Stalin was in the end more interested in the pact with Hitler than in signing any type of agreement with Britain or France. One of which is that he actually had his eyes, they were kind of watering, his mouth was watering as he was looking at German military technology. They actually submitted a list 17 pages long as early as January 1939 to the German government. This is material that the Soviets basically wanted for their Air Force, for the Navy, for the Red Army. But there are a lot of other problems. So the other thing is that it doesn't make any sense. You think about this, so were the Soviets going to sign a collective security agreement to help Poland? What? The Soviets and the Poles fought a war in 1920. The Soviets lost territory to Poland in that war. Stalin did not recognize that border as legitimate. He had a territorial dispute with Poland. He despised Poland. He hated the Poles as a people. He talked about this quite openly at times, depending on who he was talking to. In addition to all of this, you had the fact that you have territorial ambitions, you have Stalin's general kind of discomfiture regarding Poland. You also have the hard evidence. I'm amazed that historians can still get away with claiming that Stalin was devoted to collective security. When Chamberlain announced to the House of Commons, and then of course to the world, that he had signed a so-called mutual assistance pact or agreement with Poland, this is the famous guarantee of March 31st, 1939. The guarantee not of Poland's territorial integrity, that is her entire territory, the kind of thing that is significant when you look at things like Ukraine today. You have to look at the fine print, but rather Poland's independence. Okay, which implied there was wiggle room. In addition to this, not only did the Soviet Union not endorse the guarantee to Poland, they expressly and explicitly repudiated it. They said, no, we do not guarantee Poland's borders. And any press reports suggesting that we do are erroneous. The Soviets explicitly repudiated the guarantee to Poland. And in addition to this, of course, as we know, through back channels, they had already begun basically entreating with the Germans about carving up Poland. This is the other thing I discovered. The partition of Poland in 1939, carving up Poland, everyone knows, begins the Second World War, was not a German idea. It was a Soviet idea. It was proposed by the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany through back channels. People also forget this aspect of the war. Nazi Germany and Poland were actually allies of sorts between 1939 and 1934 and 1939, largely because of a shared antipathy to the Soviet Union. Poland had actually, and this is something that the Poles don't like being reminded about, usually I'm pretty friendly to Poland in this book and in this talk, but I do have to point out that at Munich, when Nazi Germany famously made the move into the Sudetenland, the Sudeten Germans, Poland also took a share of Czech territory alongside the Germans. That is, they were collaborating with the Germans. The Poles and the Germans, in fact, had a lot of prospects for agreement. Part of the reason that they didn't sign was because of the British guarantee to Poland. But in addition to this, when you look a little bit more deeply into the negotiations, you realize that in the end, the Poles, effectively, they probably should have been fearing Nazi Germany more than the Soviet Union. But in fact, until 1939, they had far more reason to fear the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviets had already started dangling the possibility of a partition of Poland again through back channels in 1938. Even the Foreign Affairs Commissar, this kind of equivalent of Foreign Minister, Litvinov, famously Jewish, the Nazis abused him in their anti-Semitic screeds. It was when Stalin sacked his Jewish Foreign Affairs Commissar that Hitler knew he was angling for a deal. This is in early May 1939. Stalin literally told Molotov, which was, of course, means hammer. This is just like Stalin and steel, hammer and steel. They used to co-sign death orders together during the terror. I mean, Molotov was both a Gentile and also, although His wife was Jewish, and she was actually in prison during a lot of this time. Stalin was a very strange individual. But so Stalin and Molotov, Stalin tells Molotov not just that Litvinov is fired, but he says, I want you to purge the foreign ministry of Jews. Fire all the Jews. This is Stalin's way of signaling to Hitler that he wants a deal. He had already technically demoted Litvinov a year and a half before that from the European desk. And Stalin never had any interest in Litvinov's vague talk about collective security. But so Stalin says, purge foreign commissariat of Jews. He gets rid of Litvinov. It means he wants to deal with Hitler. They had already proposed the deal. So the deal was basically this. This is the invasion. This is the division. It's one of these things I often tell my students when we look at maps. I'm fascinated by maps. A few years back, when ISIS was in the headlines, we were always hearing about how the maps of the modern Middle East were drawn up by Sykes and Picot. I would then show them a map of the Sykes-Picot Sezonov Agreement of 1916. It bears no relationship to the current map of the Middle East. It's just one of those myths that everyone says. The same thing here, we have all these different boundary lines, but you have to pay close attention to the details. The Soviets got away with a lot of lies during the wartime diplomacy, particularly at places like Tehran and Yalta a little bit later on. But you're going to see a couple of interesting things here. There are different lines. The first one that I'm going to highlight is no, I'm not going to do that line first. I'm going to do this line. Okay, so this one right here. This is the actual Molotov-Ribbentrop line, the map that is. We should remember that any treaty, any agreement is not set in stone. So the original map, you can kind of see here, to some extent, had that been the final map of Poland, the Soviets probably would not have gotten away with as many of their lies and white lies as they did. Because in fact, the Soviet zone was larger than the German zone. It was substantially larger. Remember, it was a Soviet proposal all along to partition Poland. In fact, the Soviets, as you're going to see here, they were going to get central Poland too. Originally, they were basically going to split up Warsaw, not unlike the way the Allies would later split up Berlin at the end of the war. And likewise, the Baltic states were going to be split up. You can see up here the original line all the way up here. Lithuania was originally supposed to be part of the German zone. It was a deal, that is to say. They were compromising. They even quibbled over who would get control of which port along the Baltic. The Soviets, as we also know, got a free hand to invade Finland. They got a free hand to invade the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And they also had a free hand for what were first euphemistically called Southeastern questions, etc., by which was meant Romania, parts of the Danube Delta, what is usually called Bessarabia. So interestingly, you're going to see that this didn't actually happen, and there's some interesting reasons that it didn't, because when the Germans invaded Poland, now the Poles, admittedly, they were a little bit shocked, not just by the scale, they knew the Germans were about to invade. They didn't know, and nor did anyone else know, about the secret clause in that agreement. People might have guessed from the headlines there was a non-aggression pact between Germany, so it's probably not good news for Poland. Poland amazingly actually petitioned the Soviets for help. This is not the last time this is going to happen in the war. This is what Japan does, by the way, after Hiroshima. They petition the Soviets for help. The Soviets say, yes, we will now invade you. Okay? So the Poles ask the Soviets for help. The Soviets don't really say anything. They just kind of, we'll see. The Germans, meanwhile, ask the Soviets, what are you doing? Why aren't you invading? Remember, they were supposed to meet up in Warsaw in the middle, and the Soviets don't invade. They don't do anything for nearly 2 weeks. In fact, the fact that the Soviets waited and camouflaged their invasion so successfully means that most people forgot it happened later on. I mean, it's kind of curious. The Wall Street Journal piece that got me in trouble was actually about Japan, but there was one I did 2 years before that, in which I simply mentioned and talked about the Soviet invasion of Finland in September 1939. And I got all these astonished letters from people saying, I had no idea. Really? They didn't even realize the Soviets invaded Poland in 1939. Now, maybe they weren't the best informed readers necessarily, but they were people interested in history, and they simply didn't know. Because in fact, what the Soviets did at first was, it was quite clever. They mobilized. They told the Germans, yes, we have now mobilized all our troops across Eastern Front. You know, the Germans can't make heads or tails. What are the Soviets doing? Why aren't they invading? Molotov has a great explanation. Well, you see, we don't want to invade just yet because this might risk inciting unity among our opponents. What does he mean by that? Oh, right, he means Britain and France might declare war on the Soviet Union. After all, they supposedly were now treaty-bound to defend Poland against foreign aggression. Now, there was a secret clause inside the secret clause of the Mutual Assistance Pact where they said, no, we really only meant Germany. But of course, it would put them in a bit of a bind. If there are two countries invading Poland, why are they only declaring war on one? Well, the Soviets delayed, they hemmed and hawed, and they came up with a great sort of a position, which is just like, all right, well, we will wait until Warsaw falls, then Poland ceases to exist, then we will send our troops in on a protection mission. This is not entirely unlike the special military operation currently undergoing in Ukraine. We will intervene to protect the beleaguered Ukrainians and Belarusians from something. Well, okay, so they wait for news that Warsaw is going to fall. On the 16th of September, they receive a news report that Warsaw has fallen. It's actually false. Warsaw holds out for more than 2 weeks after this. But they finally go, uh-oh, wait a minute, is the war going to be over? We better move in and seize our territory. And so they move in now from the east. Soviet troops move in here, they move in here, they move in here, they move in here. Interestingly, Poland's government had been trying to escape the country. First they came here, but then the Germans, you can see the five-pronged invasion, it's difficult to escape. They finally make it all the way down here close to the Romanian border. And they're right about here when the Russians invade. Poland's government now goes poof. There's nowhere to go. They don't even have enough time to negotiate exile. They finally enter Romania as prisoners. Effectively, Poland's government ceases to exist. And this is, of course, the position of Stalin and Molotov, who now summons Poland's ambassador, and he tells him, your country has ceased to exist. Your diplomatic immunity has expired. You are now under arrest. And they send him to the Gulag, along with Poland's consul in Kiev and other major Soviet cities. But you see, they haven't invaded Poland exactly. It's a protection mission into a country which no longer exists. And legally speaking, of course, they start deporting hundreds of thousands of Poles after this. And it's kind of curious the way they twist themselves in knots. I've actually read the documents from the Politburo, some of the other Soviet government agencies, how they try to describe this. They, of course, are denying that any country known as Poland exists. On the other hand, they have special prisoner categories, such as veterans of the former alleged Polish army, who are, of course, subject to various punishments, officers, merchants, etc. Now, the Nazis were not treating the Poles particularly well in their occupied zones either. They had different interests. Obviously, they're mostly going after Jews, along with some intellectual elites, kind of university professors they were suspicious of. The Soviets are deporting, frankly, nearly everyone. I mean, just about anyone they can get their hands on that they don't trust. They start privatizing the agriculture, they nationalize all the banks. I've seen all these documents too. Again, no one talks about this in the war. When the Soviets moved into a country, that meant theft, that meant mass robbery. It was communism, that's what it meant. You go after the banks first because that's where the money is. And they weren't even shy about this. They would announce in Pravda, yes, we have now helped ourselves to the contents of state banks and this bank and that bank and the credit holding institutions. They would even do this in diplomatic correspondence. After Stalin occupied the three Baltic states, this is in June of 1940, he had amazing timing. He waited until after basically the fall of Paris in the Western Front, when the world is paying attention to the fall of Paris. Pretty dramatic story. You might remember from Casablanca, the Deutsche Stein vor den Toren von Paris. Very dramatic story, a lot of headlines. So Stalin moves into the three Baltic countries and helps himself to the bank deposits and the gold reserves. The trouble there was that a lot of the gold was actually in New York and in Fort Knox. And so the Soviets actually protested with the American government. They said, you are holding up delivery of the gold which we have recently acquired from the national banks of Estonia, Latvia, in Lithuania. This was Stalin's method of doing business. So, you can see then that the war is going pretty well for Stalin. He's amazing in the way he negotiated this too. If you look at this division of Poland map, officially the Soviet position at the end of the war is that they just want to restore the Curzon line, the Curzon line, the Curzon. You're always hearing this phrase. So Curzon is Lord Curzon, former British, among other things, His Majesty's Foreign Secretary, former Viceroy to India. Curzon had established a border which in fact Poland had superseded in the 1920 war. So to a certain extent, Britain liked the Curzon line. That is part of the reason Chamberlain did not guarantee all of Poland's territory, was that Britain had never recognized that eastern part as necessarily legitimate. And so it was quite useful for Molotov to keep making these kind of white lies, all we want is Curzon line, Curzon line. In fact, they went well beyond, you can see the Curzon line is here, they went well beyond the Curzon line as well. there were a couple of, in particular, these actually become important military salients you're going to see actually in 1941, before Operation Barbarossa begins. Stalin insisted on the oil fields here in Galicia, and most of all, he came up with, and Molotov came up with this ingenious sort of territorial swap. And see, part of the reason was that, as you can see here, the Germans went way past the original armistice lines, because remember, the Soviets delayed by 16 days the entry into the war. So they eventually had to give back at least a few towns the Germans had conquered. But in the case of Warsaw, Stalin and Molotov quite cleverly said, you know what, that's all right. We won't take Warsaw, we won't take central Poland. We'll move the border over here, and meanwhile we'll take Lithuania for ourselves. So now the Soviets have this really interesting claim that they can make. Britain and France admittedly are looking for ways out anyway. They don't want to declare war on the Soviet Union. So what the Soviets tell them is, oh, but you see, we've just conquered former Russian and former Soviet territory. We didn't conquer Poland. You see, central Poland, Warsaw, Lublin, this is all German. Germans conquered Poland. We just conquered territory that used to be Russian, not Poland. And amazingly, they get away with this. You know, Britain and France decide, you know what, this is a reasonable explanation that will help us get out of the horns of a dilemma. Now we don't have to declare war on Stalin and the Soviet Union. Amazingly, they nearly do so anyway, though. And that's because of this episode, again, which is normally treated as kind of like a sideshow in the history of the war, the Winter War, the Soviet-Finnish War, treated as a sideshow in part because obviously there's a lot else going on in Europe and the Pacific. But in fact, at the time, although it's true Japan had already invaded mainland China and the Sino-Japanese War was raging, in Europe, after the fall of Poland, not a lot was happening. Remember, this was the winter of the Drôle de Guerre, the Phony War, the Sitzkrieg. In fact, at the time, this was the big story. When Stalin invaded Finland in late November 1939, it was in fact a major armed invasion that was denounced by most of the Western powers. And in fact, the Soviets were ejected from the League of Nations. Interestingly, Italy, Germany, and Japan had never been ejected from the League of Nations. As the League Secretary caustically put it, he said, well, yes, Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany and Japan at least had decency to resign from League first before committing acts of armed aggression. The Soviets had not, so they're actually denounced. You start hearing these stories eerily similar to some of the stories we were hearing coming out of Ukraine, particularly in late February, early March, about the heroic resistance and the Russians kind of getting bogged down and humiliating themselves. I don't want to give all of the story away here, but this is a little bit of bad news that might have to sink in. Although they got really bad press and the war was a humiliation for the Red Army, the Russians did win in the end. Important to remember that. But in the meantime, they nearly fell into hostilities with Britain and France. And this is an episode where I cannot figure out why, but the part about my book which has offended the most people in one place, in Britain they cannot stand hearing about this. How close they came to war against the Soviet Union in early 1940. They came so close that, in fact, British pilots were conducting surveillance overflights of Baku and Batumi, Soviet oil installations. It doesn't seem like that'd be related to Finland, but in fact, we shouldn't forget that although Poland's government had ceased to exist, later it's reborn in a new form as the Polish government in exile in London. In addition to this, a lot of Polish veterans of both the Army and particularly the Air Force are, of course, taking up arms for Britain. We later see service in places like D-Day, Monte in Italy, and in particular, actually, in the Battle of Britain, over the skies of Britain. Many of the aces in the RAF, and particularly those who would fly the missions later in the war to aid Warsaw, were Polish. And so there are all these Poles who are now training, not just to deal a blow against Nazi Germany, but many of them hope they might get a chance to settle scores with Stalin. And so there's a lot of talk of Polish soldiers being recruited to intervene in Finland and possibly in the Caucasus. The Caucasus is important, not just the reason the British were focused on it. It wasn't just, of course, important for Stalin and the Soviet economy, but because the Soviets, as part of their pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, are, of course, supplying oil and petroleum to Nazi Germany. So the German Wehrmacht, in particular, of course, the famous Panzers and the Luftwaffe, are heavily dependent on, effectively by 1940, they're getting something like 83% of their petroleum, their natural oil resources, either from Romania or from the Soviet Union. And by then, the Soviets also had something of a stranglehold over the Romanian oil as well. So the Brits thought they could deal a blow here. And in fact, they nearly, they came very close in April 1940, but Stalin, he had a very effective intelligence network, and so not only did he know what they were up to, he also called in a lot of Americans, a lot of American geologists and oilmen who had been working in the Caucasus, who were leaving in part because of the Roosevelt administration placing certain, not very effective sanctions on Stalin. They're all leaving through Moscow, and they're being debriefed by the Russians, and Stalin was desperate. He actually calls in all this information about what's going on in the Caucasus, what's going to happen if they bomb it. Basically, the point was the oil derricks were only about 50 yards apart, in the Caspian. This is where, if you might remember, the cult of Zoroastrianism, where basically the petroleum bubbles up from underneath. Effectively, there would be this kind of world historical conflagration that would be impossible to put out and would decimate the Soviet oil industry. And they didn't have any aircraft guns in the area. Curiously enough, it was right after Stalin heard this, and he heard that Britain and France were about to intervene against him using Polish volunteers, that Stalin ordered what we now know as the Katyn Forest Massacre. You might have heard of the story. It's kind of a famous story, in part because the Soviets at first denied that it happened. The official position of the US government until 1951 was that it was a Nazi German, not a Soviet crime. What has almost never been explained, I can't take full credit for this, was a British historian called Nikolai Tolstoy, who was actually the great-grandson of Tolstoy. He also, oddly, has the literary rights to the Patrick O'Brien estate, the Master and Commander series of novels. It's a very long story. He's a very interesting man. And I have to give him credit, because he's the one who tipped me off to the story. It was in early March 1940, as the war in Finland was still going, and as the Allies were preparing to strike against the Soviet oil fields, that Stalin ordered this decapitation strike against the Polish officer class. Premeditated mass murder of... Interestingly, they didn't meet their quota. They always had the death quotas. They were supposed to whack about 26,000 Polish officers and government elites. In the end, they got only, I think it was 22,981. I think the exact figure is pretty close. Murdered in cold blood. They weren't murdered in the Katyn Forest. That's where they dumped most of the bodies. They were mostly killed in cities. Bullet to the back of the head. Stalin had a long memory, about things like Trotsky, about things like the Soviet-Polish War. So curiously enough, again, this explains not just the Katyn Forest Massacre. You see why people might not like the story in Britain, because it's not like I blame Britain for this, obviously not, but they just don't like being reminded about it. In part because it didn't happen in the end. But that's because Stalin was too clever for them. Stalin realized what was happening, and so in addition to this preemptive mass murder of Polish officers and elites in Russia, there are all these reverberations of the story. So about a year later, after the Nazis have ripped up the pact and invaded the Soviet Union, Britain and the Polish exile government started raising queries about all the Polish prisoners in Russia and whether some of them could be put together into an armed force. And a very few of them were. In the end, about 20 or 25,000 were. What they didn't realize yet, because no one knew, was that those 15,000 officers, along with the 8,000 odd civilians, were dead. So the officers they hoped to lead them into battle had already been killed. No one knew that. But so this near war, the other thing Stalin did was he actually sued for a peace treaty with Finland. No one was really expecting. In fact, curiously enough, they had reversed the momentum. The Soviets, basically, they put about 600,000 men. Just briefly look at this map here. They put about 600,000 men right here into the, into the isthmus, the Karelian isthmus, and just by sheer force of weight and gravity, they started bludgeoning the Finns into submission. And Mannerheim and the Finns eventually just said, look, we're fighting bravely, but we're going to run out of men in about 3 months. So Stalin sued for peace, and he did not get all of his terms, but he made a compromise, and he thereby avoided incurring the enmity of Britain and France. And that's when Hitler came to Stalin's rescue. Things looked bleak for Stalin in March of 1940. The Soviets were being humiliated in Finland, it seems. Britain and France were about to declare war on him. But then, in the course of just about 5 or 6 weeks, the Germans make their moves into Denmark and Norway. From Stalin's perspective, you see what this did was it removed the British threat. Britain he still saw as the greater threat to Nazi Germany, well on into 1940. And the British being involved, and the British had these plans, to land troops up in Norway. Stalin was terrified of this. So basically Hitler bailed out his bacon. In fact, the Soviets were grateful. They were so happy when the Germans, first of all, occupied Norway, and then, of course, invaded France in the Low Countries. No, the only thing that wasn't quite as good from Stalin's perspective, and here's where we're going to see there's a little bit of a shift between Europe and Asia, and I'll get to the Asian front momentarily. It didn't go quite according to plan with Stalin. I mean, he absolutely was hoping by signing this pact not just to gain territory, but he was hoping to incite and embroil the capitalist powers of war. The problem was the Germans kept winning. You know, Stalin wanted, just like in the First World War, he thought that the Germans, the British, and the French, they would bloody each other up and destroy each other. And instead, France falls in 6 weeks. You know, so while the Soviets were initially quite euphoric when they heard the news about Hitler's invasion of France in the Low Countries, they stepped up delivery of oil. We shouldn't forget the invasion of France in the Low Countries, like the Battle of Britain, was, of course, literally fueled by Stalin and the Soviet Union, who were shipping as much motor fuel as they could to the Nazis in this time. They stepped it up right at the end of May and early June 1940. Stalin was absolutely complicit in all of this. They even collaborated in some of the Norwegian operations together. Effectively, they were military allies, just not necessarily equally on all fronts. But again, you know, kind of it's a little bit alarming that the Germans are winning so easily. You know, still Stalin's going to take advantage. You know, he makes these moves that I talked about. So after he invaded the Baltic countries, I already talked about that in late June, right after the fall of France. You know, he moves into Romania. This is where Stalin kind of overplayed his hand. Okay, so he had already agreed, you know, in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Bessarabia, this area right here, you can see basically kind of like from the delta, you know, roughly up to the Dniester, kind of Khotin, Chernivtsi. A lot of this is now in Ukraine, but anyway, so this territory right here had been agreed more or less as a Soviet zone of influence, but Stalin started demanding Bukovina as well, which had not been mentioned in any previous agreement, which had never belonged to Russia. And there was actually this one amazing exchange between Molotov and the German ambassador to Moscow. Schulenburg was his name. The first time Schulenburg didn't know what to say. He was so shocked that, you know, even though the Germans seemed to be the world beaters, it's the Soviets who were getting so much territory. And so, you know, he comes back to the next meeting and he brings out an ethnographic encyclopedia. So Molotov is claiming, and this is kind of interesting, he's claiming that Bukovina should belong to the Soviet Union because it's full of Ukrainians who are being oppressed by minority of Romanians. I don't know how that really worked in Molotov's mind. He had these figures, it's like, you know, 38.7% versus 38.3% or something. But so Schulenburg breaks out an ethnographic encyclopedia. He says, no, you see, like, these people live here. You know, Moshe says, no, this is BS Romanian encyclopedia, not to be trusted. Eventually, they sort of come to terms, but sort of not. The real problem here is Ploshti, above Bucharest. The Germans are getting more than half of their natural oil from Romania. And the Soviets are now moving into Romania, and a little bit later, they start demanding Bulgaria as well. So in November 1940, when Molotov visits Berlin, you remember the previous time it was Ribbentrop who had gone to Moscow. This time, for the first time, Molotov goes to Berlin. And I think quite interestingly, had Stalin gone to Berlin, the entire war might have turned out different. But Stalin didn't travel. He was so hyper-paranoid. He hadn't even flown before he went to Tehran. And he always had to have massive security detail, bodyguards, full control of all comms, all communications, logistics, everything. It took poor Roosevelt. You know, I'll get into this in a moment, like the negotiations before both Tehran and Yalta, you know. Like, could we meet in Canada maybe? Or, okay, if not Canada, okay, maybe we could meet somewhere, you know, like Mid-Atlantic, maybe England, or maybe the Mediterranean. Stalin, no, you will come closer to my lair. I don't care that you're wheelchair bound. I don't care about your health problems. I don't care about your high blood pressure, that you might die if your plane flies above a certain altitude. You will come to my lair. So Stalin would never travel really outside the few times he might visit the front. But so instead Molotov goes. And Molotov was kind of a cold fish. You know, Hitler tried to impress him with all these grandiose gestures. They all fell flat. The Germans thought that they had negotiated something with Molotov. But I've seen the actual communication between Molotov and Stalin. Molotov made clear that he had utterly fooled the Germans. Basically, what was at stake was this. Okay, so rewind to 1940. You've probably heard of the Axis. You might have heard of the Anti-Comintern Pact. It has now been restyled the Tripartite Pact. It's no longer anti-Comintern, because of course that implies anti-Soviet. The Soviets are now allied to Germany. So they're going to try to turn it into a four-power pact to divide up the world and basically declare war on the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon powers. The US is still neutral, but it's seen as very much in Britain's camp. There's no real doubt about that, neither the German or the Russian. And so basically they talk about terms. And the terms are, well, okay, are we going to, are we going to allow the Soviets to have more territory in Europe, maybe in the South? The Germans want the Soviets to focus on Turkey, Iran, maybe Afghanistan. Yeah, Molotov isn't let in by this. Stalin says, no, you must focus on Bulgaria and Turkish Straits. The famous Straits, where if you've read my earlier books, you know it's one of my big leitmotifs, Russians' obsession with the Turkish Straits. But so, the Straits coming from, of course, the Bosporus, down through the Sea of Marmara, and eventually the Dardanelles. They want to revise the Straits Convention, the Montreux Convention. Mostly, they want permission to invade Bulgaria and station troops at the Bosporus. And this is what Stalin says is his price. He also wants the Germans to remove all troops and military personnel from Finland and from Romania. Finland is interesting. Actually, he goes so hard on Finland. Hitler actually asked Molotov at one point, are you planning to invade Finland again? And Molotov's response is, not if constant anti-Soviet agitation in Finnish press ceases. Which is not exactly a no. So the Soviets are threatening Finland, they're threatening Romania. Now remember, Romania is where the Germans get more than half of their oil. They cannot basically run a war without Romanian oil. And the Soviets are now demanding that the Germans withdraw their troops. Oh yeah, and they're demanding to occupy Bulgaria, and they're already here and they're there. And in fact, the Soviet Air Force has already been conducting surveillance flights of, among other things, the Ploshki oil fields. So, the Germans are a little concerned. That said, they think that Molotov has been polite enough and they think that they're going to come to terms. And when Molotov leaves, they actually think there's a prospect of a deal. Instead, Stalin basically gives Hitler an ultimatum. It's like written down on a cocktail napkin. I guess they didn't want a full typographic record of it. It was basically an ultimatum. It was like these five. One of them had to do with Sakhalin in Japan, but mostly it was Germans withdraw from Finland and Romania, Soviets get to invade Bulgaria, Soviets get to station troops at the Straits, etc. Well, Hitler, as we know, said no. He didn't agree to all of this. He thought it was amazing that Stalin, after the Germans had really done the vast majority of the actual military damage in the war, was being so uppity and demanding. He was like a jumped-up Mussolini. He was like a Mussolini on steroids, asking for the little crumbs for the German war machine, having done very little in Hitler's view to determine them. And I've actually seen, this is one of my most proud discoveries. It was actually not in the Russian archives. It was in the Bulgarian archives, believe it or not. The moment, I think, when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. So this is on December 3rd, 1940, and he's just received this ultimatum from Stalin, and he just stemwinder. He goes on in one of his rants for 3.5 hours about how he finally knows the true Stalin and what Stalin's about and what Stalin's up to. He makes all these promises to Bulgaria, and you get this whole sort of winter battle over Bulgaria, and eventually, of course, Greece and these other places. And basically, the Germans and the Russians start preparing for Armageddon. So Barbarossa, I'm sure we're familiar with the basic outlines of the story, how the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, ripping up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Well, I'm not going to wade too far into the complexities of the debate over Soviet war plans and intentions, but let me just hint to you now that there's a little bit more to the story than you might have heard in most World War II history books. For example, those famous salients I talked about that the Soviets had insisted on having here in Poland are being absolutely ringed with Soviet troops and tanks. They're building tank parks, they're building fuel depots, air bases. Here's one of my own discoveries. Okay, so Soviet air bases, or aerodromes as they call them, of the 251 under construction in the first 6 months of 1941, 199, that's about 79.5%, call it 80%, are built in districts abutting the German Reich. Districts occupied by the Soviets since 1939. If you add those in basically the Kiev military district here, you get close to 90 or 95%. So this is where the Soviets are putting their armor, it's where the Soviets are putting their air force, the Soviets are preparing for war. Now how would that war start? No one knew. The Soviets didn't know, the Germans probably didn't know. part of what caught the Soviets by surprise was that while it took the Soviets the better part of 2 years, ramping up over the last 6 months to not quite be ready for the war that was coming, although they were getting close. The Germans, if you might remember, they're busy all spring. I mean, they're busy rolling up Greece and Yugoslavia and the Balkans, and then they make these moves into Egypt and Iraq, and then amazingly, just in about 5 or 6 weeks, they suddenly pivot and they mass up an army of about 3 million men on the Eastern Front. The Germans, shall we say, were pretty effective at logistics, a little bit faster than the Russians were. So the Russians, there's kind of a panic that sets in at the last minute. And I've seen this, amazingly, you can see right in the Politburo files. They know what's happening. This whole idea, oh, Stalin was so shocked, he fell into a drunken stupor. It's all BS. Okay, they knew what was coming. To some extent, there was disbelief, yes, because the Germans were just so fast. But the last-minute orders of the Politburo, they're saying things like, we must desperately camouflage all of the new air bases. We need to camouflage the tank parks and build dummy tanks and dummy aerodromes. And the completion dates for all of this camouflage maskirovka operation was something like either July 5th or July 15th or July 25th. And as we know, of course, the Germans invaded on June 22nd. And they did pretty well in the early days. And, again, the normal story is, well, the Germans make this massive progress, and then general winter and the floods of the Rasputitsa, or the months that come every October and November, slowed them down, and eventually Stalin helped to revive patriotism. They rehabilitated the church. They started saluting their Russian military ancestors, and the heroic patriotic Red Army saw off the invaders, and the Great Patriotic War, and all the rest of the story. Well, there are a lot of problems with the traditional story, particularly the more propagandistic Soviet version of the story. I mean, to begin with, the Germans took almost 4 million prisoners in 1941 alone. It's astonishing if you actually look at the level. And yes, the Germans did not treat them well, and this is one of those war crimes that people are starting to pay attention to. But it's kind of hard to feed 4 million prisoners, even if you want to treat them well, which the Germans didn't particularly want to. The other thing, and this is a fact, every so often I say this out loud, even though I know it's going to get me into trouble. The Soviet Union was not a signatory to the Geneva or Hague Conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. Nazi Germany was. That didn't mean they treated all of them well. They did accord certain protections to some British and American prisoners of war, obviously with abuses. The Germans proposed to the Soviets that they exchange prisoner lists and allow Red Cross inspection of prisoner of war camps. The Soviets said no. We don't actually know much about what happened to German and Hungarian and Slovak and other prisoners of war taken on the Eastern Front. We don't know much about it. The world didn't want to know. The Red Cross didn't want to know. The other thing the Germans did, of course, is a lot of destruction, obviously, scorched earth. And the other part of the story is, the heroic evacuation of industry to the east. I was looking at the files of the Soviet Ministry of Aerodrome Construction, and it really is this astonishing story. Like, every single resource available is sent west for the first 6 months of 1941. And then it all goes east as soon as the Germans invade. Except it didn't all go east, because, of course, they couldn't get everything evacuated in time. Most of those air bases were either destroyed, incinerated, or captured on the ground. Something like 80 to 90% of the Soviet Air Force in most units was destroyed in the first days of the invasion. I looked at the Materialschlacht, as the Germans called this aspect of the war. The famous T-34 tank, all these Soviet tanks we're always hearing about. They were losing those in 1941 at a pace of 3 or 4 times the production rate, because, of course, production collapsed. It collapsed because so many of the factories were here. The entire complex for Red Army boot and uniform construction was in the occupied Baltic area and this area of northern European Russia. It was all taken by the Germans. That's why the Red Army had to rely on, of course, American cloth and American rubber, and American shoes and American boots and American spam and American borscht. All that borscht sent over in those tiny little packages to Soviet specifications. I've seen the recipe. It definitely included bay leaves, I can tell you that. So all that stuff they had to get. So we have factories. Like I'm sure you've heard about the Battle of Stalingrad. Part of what was at stake. Ooh, I guess I didn't have my Stalingrad map here, but we have to go a little bit further east to get to Stalingrad. Stalingrad, of course, had some major tank factories. It was actually responsible for, in some sectors of Soviet defense, 10 to 20% of production. This is very much a material war. I mean, Hitler both for to a fault, was obsessed with these things. Part of the reason why they went after the oil in 1942, invading the Caucasus. There's one battle actually up in the north I'll mention just because it's a little bit obscure. The military historians might be curious about this. The Germans eventually went not just to Leningrad, they actually went to the east of Leningrad to Tikhvin. And I've read these interesting military histories that are puzzling their heads. Why did the Germans go to Tikhvin? It makes no sense. Now, it's true there was one rail connection from the east to Leningrad, and so they think maybe they were trying to encircle the city and it was an ancillary operation. No! Because that's where most of Soviet bauxite production was located. And this is what they needed, of course, to smelt into aluminum. A lot of those aluminum plants were designed by American and French firms, particularly American firms. The Soviets lost 60 to 70% of their aluminum production because of the German invasion. And they used aluminum not just in, well, I suppose like soda cans like we might today, but all of the air forces used it for their warplanes. You know, they hadn't come up with the modern composite materials we have yet today. It was light, you needed it for airplanes. The Soviets used it in their tanks as well. They used it in the KV series tank, they used it in the T-34 tank. Again, they lost 60 to 70% of their aluminum production. They lost similar percentages of everything from steel, things like coal, grain, wheat. We're hearing a lot about that in Ukraine today. Ukraine, of course, the breadbasket of Russia. Ukraine is now under German occupation. The Germans undercut their own case, by the way, to be liberating, you know, the victims of Ukraine and Russia from the collective farms, because they actually left the collective farms largely intact because they could centralize the grain controls. But the industry of Ukraine, of course, falls to the invader. And it wasn't all destroyed. For some reason, the Russians despaired of destroying the local distilleries and beer complexes. And the Germans were quite pleased that they hadn't been destroyed. But anyway, they destroyed a lot. There was a lot of scorched earth, but they simply could not have mounted that production miracle that they're always talking about, the triumph of socialist industry, even such as it was, and they exaggerated the figures by a factor of 2 or 3, without, of course, American steel, processed steel, armor plate, aluminum, coal, ball bearings, chromeless steel, other inputs, everything from barbed wire to track for rail lines, finished products too, of course. We shouldn't forget about the wheels. Jeeps, see one of them over in the museum. Harley Davidsons, we'll talk about that in a moment. Particularly the P-39 era Cobra, manufactured by Bell Aircraft. I have, my editor drove me crazy with this, but he kept saying, like, no, after a certain point, you don't even mention the Politburo in your book, but you keep talking about the P-39 era Cobra. The Kobrushka, Stalin's favorite fighter plane. He became obsessed with it. In fact, he would get angry when the Americans would hold up deliveries. Because the Soviets were so dependent on some of these products. And yes, even the tanks. So it's like, oh, we didn't need you. We have much better tanks. We don't need your tanks. This is this great Soviet sort of propaganda thing. I was able to dig information. I can't tell you how I got it. Dig information out of the Soviet military archive in Podolsk. Never getting back in there again, nor will probably any other Western researcher be able to see this material now that I've exposed it, pointing out how many British and American and Canadian tanks were actually incorporated into Red Army units in the Battle of Moscow 1941, Stalingrad 1942, Kursk Citadel 1943, Bagration, that was the great big Soviet offensive into Poland and parts of East Prussia in 1944. And some of those offensives, again, with tanks, it's a lower percentage than it was in the Air Force or with things like Jeeps, where you're talking about probably motorized vehicles. The Americans are providing something like 70, 80, 90%. Tanks is lower, but it's usually in the range of 20, 30, 40%. It's a significant amount, particularly when you consider that a lot of the Soviet production also required on American industrial inputs, metallurgy, etc. And eventually, I mean, this is what gives the Red Army its mobility. And I've had a lot of these debates and kind of arguments with people about the book. The argument about Lend-Lease is usually, well, look, I mean, from an almost cynical American perspective, better for the Red Army to do the fighting and the dying than us. Okay, I get it. You know, on the other hand, there's the reciprocity angle. So if Britain and America are sacrificing, and in the case of Britain, it's even more dramatic, right? Churchill famously sends these 200 Hawker Hurricane fighters, workhorse of the RAF. They're supposed to go defend Singapore, which of course falls to Japan in large part, the biggest debacle in British imperial military history, in large part because he sent them to Stalin instead, free of charge. They end up sending hundreds of tanks and warplanes to Stalin in 1941, setting back British production targets by years. They sent aluminum to Stalin, setting back British aircraft production. This basically dooms Britain as a great power. I think this is part of the reason why, even though I personally think most of these things you might see as either flattering to Churchill for selflessness, or at the very least pointing out that kind of sacrificial spirit of Britain in the war. My book is, there are a lot of British readers and reviewers who have not been happy about some of the stuff that I talk about. But these were conscious decisions. Churchill literally did sacrifice British imperial interests in order to bail out Stalin and the Red Army in 1941 and 1942. And there's an argument to be made, too, for the United States. Although it's a little stranger, because when it starts, the U.S. isn't at war. The U.S. is, of course, neutral in June 1941. And in fact, for the next 6 months or so, the Lend-Lease aid is camouflaged. It's so secret that U.S. diplomats are actually given instructions not to talk about it in public, because it hasn't been cleared with the U.S. public. In fact, the Roosevelt administration, they did push polls. They had Gallup polls, they had their own polls. They knew that a vast majority of Americans were opposed to this policy, but they went ahead and they did it anyway. They thought it was the right thing to do. Maybe it was. 1941, to keep the Soviets in the war. Definitely an argument there. 1942, okay, the Soviets are in the war, they're under pressure at Stalingrad, so you could see it. You could see the logic behind this letter that I discovered in the German military archives, where a German general actually wrote home to his wife, and he said that more than 50% of the tanks and armored vehicles in these units sent against us are American-made, American manufactured. Stalingrad we're talking about. You could see the angle. Of course, 1943, the last German offensive, maybe you could see it. And by then, the entire Soviet defense would have been impossible without American mines and barbed wire and cranes. We're seeing these cranes and industrial lifts. I've seen the correspondence from the American manufacturers. Some of them are saying, do you realize we're actually sending equipment with an industrial use of about 50 or 60 years to a competitor? They were sending technology transfer for free. Things like the Norden bomb sight, the atomic program. Yes, they were sending them enriched uranium. Vast amounts of, the Soviets, they actually had someone, once they realized they could get away with this stuff, they actually had a full-time person at the U.S. Patent Office who was just making copies. And they shipped them all in these airplanes, which went up to Great Falls, Montana, and then Alaska as part of the ALCID program. The same warplanes were sending them, a lot of them actually carried top secret documents or blueprints. Interestingly, Stalin was so insistent about the terms of delivery that it wasn't just that U.S. pilots were not allowed to fly those warplanes onto Soviet territory. They weren't allowed to go as far as Nome. The Soviets would take delivery in Fairbanks. Thank you very much. So the Soviet Air Force kind of took over Fairbanks during the war. And oddly enough, I discovered they bought up all the local perfume. There are all these perfume shortages. People were trying to figure out why these gruff, unshaven Soviet pilots are all buying, mechanics are buying perfume. I guess it's because they didn't have deodorant or something back in the Soviet Union. They didn't know any better. So, on the other hand, they drank the locals under the table. There are all these stories about the legendary drinking exploits of the Russians. But so these Americans are not allowed to fly to the Soviet Union. The reason, of course, is because if they hadn't flown into the Soviet Far East, they would have been arrested and interned as prisoners of war. Now, we know this because that is what happened to hundreds of American pilots who crash-landed or landed on Soviet territory after bombing raids on Japan. They were interned as prisoners of war by the Soviet government. And everyone was sworn to the strictest secrecy about this. During the Tehran conference, there was this one American prisoner, who was basically sick enough that they were worried he was going to die, and so they sent him as almost like a diplomatic gift to Roosevelt, like, here you go, we'll let one guy. And some of them, they would sort of allow them to escape, and then they would, have to walk across the desert sands of Central Asia, into Iran, sworn to secrecy, mind you. This is why one of the things, all my time in Russia, and I love many things about Russians as a people, but when they would bellyache about the second front, where is your second front? You send the spam, where is your second front? You mean like the second front against Japan? Where the Soviets were not only neutral, but so loyal to Japan that they were arresting American pilots? Roosevelt asked Stalin for help against Japan hundreds of times, every single time. No. Нет.
Нет, we need help in Europe. That is where war is. Not Japan. No. Нет.
Roosevelt even offered at one point to allow U.S. and British pilots to serve in the Soviet Air Force under Soviet command in the Caucasus.
Stalin said, no, we want your planes, not your pilots. Please send us those thousands of Airacobras and A-20 Havoc bombers free of charge. Thank you very much. Planes, not pilots.
Well, it works out very well for them. They, in the end, acquired the mobility where they can, of course, read. This is just a brief sort of a map about the convoy routes. Before I get to the Asian theater, where I hope to wrap things up, I'll bring back this first photo here you might remember. So these are Harley Davidsons. There's one right over there on display in the museum. These are some of the thousands of Harley Davidsons set to the Red Army free of charge. These particular Harley Davidsons, however, were regifted by Stalin to his Polish communist puppets, Berlingowski, the Berling men. Those are the ones who were supposed to symbolically occupy Warsaw at the time of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. It didn't happen because, in the end, the Soviets, they didn't actually make it into Warsaw until January 45, when the city had been reduced to a population of about 150,000 from pre-war 1.3 million. It was a bombed-out, depopulated ruin. No, these are the Harley Davidsons that they mounted as they were going around eastern Poland, hunting down Polish patriots and the Polish Home Army who had risen up against the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising and were treated by Stalin as dangerous political enemies. So they're riding around in Harley Davidsons, helping to track down those enemies. I've talked a lot about the European front. I don't want to run too far over time here, so just briefly I'll talk about some of the contrasts and similarities in the Pacific theater, in part because this is actually what got me into trouble with the Russian government. Curiously enough, what I was talking about is not up in the Wall Street Journal. Some of the things I've already mentioned, the arresting of the US pilots, is not something the Russians want the world to be reminded about, the way they treated American pilots in the Second World War. But I also pointed out that when Stalin signed the neutrality pact with Japan in April 1941, the express intent, the reason he signed this pact with Japan, aside from giving the Soviets the ability to transfer some troops and armor from basically Asia, which did help them to finally turn the tide of the Battle of Moscow, December 1941, the Siberian reinforcement. But no, it was because Japan, of course, had been fighting on the mainland, on and off, both with China but Russia, going back to really 1904. Japan had been in Korea since that war, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. There are active border disputes in Sakhalin, also in Asia, near the Korean border. The Soviets and the Japanese had fought various pretty serious skirmishes. There was a battle in 1939. And both sides were interested in potentially reaching a deal, even though they had a lot of disputes. But so from the Japanese perspective, quieting what was to them their northern Asian front would of course allow them both to focus more troops further south in China and also to contemplate a strike against Indonesia, Malaysia, US and Britain positions in the Pacific, along with, of course, Pearl Harbor. And from the Soviet perspective, of course, that was fantastic. It wasn't just that Japan would keep the Anglo-Saxon capitalist powers tied down. As Stalin put it, as he told Matsuoka, the Japanese ambassador, we are not now friends with Anglo-Saxon powers, and we did not wish to befriend them. So Stalin signed this pact. Japan sort of took the bait. Stalin, he gave it a little bit of a shove. He had an agent called Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, who was a Soviet agent. He also helped to create the Bretton Woods system alongside John Maynard Keynes, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. And among other things, he was responsible for designing those ever more draconian import controls against Japan in 1941. And he also was the principal author of what is known to history as the Hull Note, or memorandum, the last-minute sort of memorandum cum ultimatum that the United States sent to Japan shortly before Pearl Harbor, which Japan used and cited as essentially its casus belli, that these terms weren't acceptable to us. And so we're going to go ahead and make our own history and try to seal oil resources on our own, since the Americans won't sell us any oil, etc. So he helped give it a shot, he helped push it along. And in fact, Stalin's foreign policy, his strategy in Asia worked out brilliant. In fact, far better than in Europe. In Europe, remember, it nearly went wrong because the Germans kept winning too quickly and too easily. in Asia. We got the bloody war to end all wars. A bloody war in China tying down who knows how many divisions. Oh, and by the way, Roosevelt was taken in by his son and other advisors, and ultimately those working with Stilwell in China. By the end of the war, he had become convinced that, in fact, Mao was really the one doing the fighting against the Japanese. It wasn't Chiang Kai-shek. No, in fact, Stalin brokered an agreement in 1940 where Japan would not attack Mao's communist forces, and Mao, in turn, would not attack Japanese forces. There was an utter and total lie, an utter myth, and this myth was one of the reasons why the United States both decided not in Tehran to undertake the so-called Bay of Bengal operation, or Buccaneer, to open up the Burma Road to supply China over land. It's also why the U.S. effectively cut off Chiang Kai-shek after 1943. So Chiang Kai-shek, who's been engaged in this war against the Japanese invaders going all the way back to 1931, the basic premise of almost all U.S. foreign policy in Asia is cut off, and he receives about 0.1% of Lend-Lease aid in 1943 and 1944. Stalin, has betrayed every possible pact, the norm of international decency. Stalin and the Soviet Union were given priority 1 ratings in the queue. They actually had the same requisition forms as the U.S. Army had. Just fill them out. Just send it to us. So the U.S., as we know, effectively kind of leaves Chiang Kai-shek on his own. And Stalin, the thing is that, as the U.S. and Britain, fighting Japan, bleeding themselves dry in the Pacific, places like Okinawa, Peleliu, with the Old Breed, wonderful, wonderful book. As they're suffering and bleeding and dying, and of course, knocking the stuffing out of the Japanese, so that the Japanese in the end had transferred about 1 million troops back to the mainland before the Soviets invaded Manchuria. Remember, Manchuria, this is what the war was about in the first place, just like Poland was what it was about in Europe. This is the Japanese invaded here in 1931. Right, so anyway, so Mao, who has done no fighting against Japan, Mao is going to end up, of course, at the end of the war with control of Manchuria. Now, how did that happen? Well, at Tehran and then Yalta, Roosevelt agreed on a kind of deal with Stalin, where even though you're offering me no help now, and promising nothing, and arresting my pilots in Asia, so long as you promise maybe to declare war on Japan 3 months after the war in Europe is over, and not a moment sooner, you can have Manchuria, and you can have Sakhalin, and you can have the Kuril Islands. And oh, by the way, they added this part at Yalta. You can have Korea too, North Korea. Okay? Right. So this is the deal. Now, curiously enough, as you probably know, Roosevelt died April 12, 1945. Truman comes to power, and although he doesn't change everything right away, he does begin to chart a somewhat different course, at least regarding Asian policy. The final drama of the Pacific, what makes it so interesting, is that on the one hand, again, it's working out perfectly for Stalin. The Allies have done all the work, they've done all the suffering, all the bleeding, all the dying, everything. Oh, and meanwhile, they have shipped Stalin straight through Japanese territorial waters, Vladivostok, 8.244 million tons of war material free of charge, which is now in the Soviet Far East. In the last 14 months of the Pacific War, they sent nearly 2 million tons, just in the last 14 months. 9,000 warplanes, more than 1 million tons of motor and aviation fuel, free of charge. In fact, at the end, they did settle 10 years later at about 10 cents on the dollar or something, but effectively free of charge. So, no money up front. Anyway, so all this piling up, Vladivostok, logistical equipment. The Soviets even set specifications. Okay, it's not enough that you're going to give us a free hand in Manchuria and Sakhalin and all the rest. You need to equip our Soviet Far Eastern at your expense, U.S. taxpayer expense. They had a whole list. Now here's what we need. We need this much. We need this much food, this much fuel, this much ammunition. Send it all to us. And they did. And then at the last minute, Truman, once he hears, when he's at Potsdam, he hears about the tests. Alamogordo, New Mexico, he hears that there's this kind of code language that the U.S. has detonated its first atomic device. He thinks that maybe he could kind of wiggle out. Maybe we can win the war without the Soviet Union, despite everything that Roosevelt promised. And so this is why the U.S. cut Stalin out of the Potsdam Declaration. So curiously enough, the Soviets don't sign the Potsdam Declaration, which is effectively a kind of ultimatum to Japan.
And as I think I mentioned earlier, after Hiroshima, after the first atomic bomb is dropped, Japan, of course, petitioned Soviets. They're still neutral. They're still Japan's friend, of course. They petition Stalin. They say, can you mediate a peace after this terrible weapon has been dropped on us by the Americans? And, Stalin says, in your own interest, effectively, Molotov, not Stalin, effectively, we have decided to invade you. Now, curiously enough, they had to move up the timetable. The thing about Truman and his effort to sort of muscle Stalin out, it nearly worked. Originally, the Soviets were not able to mount Operation August Storm until about August 25th. They bumped it up first by a week, then 2 weeks, and then once they got word about what the Americans were up to. In fact, the Enola Gay was supposed to originally fly on August 1st. There was some bad weather, which delayed it by about 5 days, which worked to Stalin's advantage. But even then, August 6th, when Hiroshima happened, it was too soon, they weren't ready yet. They, amazingly enough, waited until the day the second atomic bomb was dropped. And the way they timed it was quite remarkable. They called in the Japanese ambassador, and they effectively told him, and it turned out that they told him the Soviet troops had already crossed the frontier, that effectively, instead of mediating a peace, we're now going to invade you. And so, of course, they invaded Manchuria, and they invaded Korea, and they invaded Sakhalin, and they invaded the Kuril Islands and the Habamai Islands, which turned out to be the frontier. They also wanted Hokkaido, and this is the last interesting part, the northernmost of the Japanese main islands. At the last minute, in fact, they were trying to negotiate here, and Stalin demanded everything north of the Rumai-Shira line. But as I put it in my book, Truman was not Roosevelt. He said no. For the first time in the war, an American said no to Stalin. And so no, Stalin did not get Hokkaido Island. But of course, the Soviets did get Manchuria, which they later turned over to Mao. They turned over all of the captured Japanese arms stocks. They, of course, sent Mao artillery and tanks. And and by the way, the Americans decided, I guess, in part because someone had convinced them. It's curious about Chiang Kai-shek. I'm sure you've heard the stories, too, about corruption and about his wife and, her shoe collection, a little bit like Imelda Marcos and all this. I was in a freshman year seminar at Stanford, again, this is back 30 years ago, and I remember I was mouthing some version of this talking point about Chiang Kai-shek, and we soured on him because of the corruption in his government and all this. And it turned out that his grandniece was in the seminar with me. So she sort of set me straight a little bit, and I've never forgotten it. So I've never forgotten that while it is probably true there was corruption in Chongqing, and there was certainly corruption in the government, that's not the reason why we cut Chiang Kai-shek off with Lend-Lease, both in 1943. He got a bit in 45, but then, of course, 1946, we cut off China entirely. Supposedly, again, it was because, he's being so quarrelsome, and he refuses not to use our aid against Mao. Even though, of course, Mao was using Soviet aid and captured Japanese army and turned over by the Red Army against Chiang Kai-shek. It's rather curious about the timing that the Truman Doctrine is about to be proclaimed in Europe. There was no Truman Doctrine for China. I think I'm going to wrap things up right there and leave some time for questions.
Questions?
Have you ever thought that Roosevelt was a red, or that most of the stuff he did was for the benefit of Stalin all the way through?
Well, I've been accused of saying that.
Unconditional surrender.
Yeah.
And that Japan would have surrendered in 44. And when Truman got in, he said, well, the emperor can stay, so it wasn't unconditional surrender. But everything you said...
Well, they said that eventually, right? But unfortunately, they didn't say it early enough to make...
Unfortunately.
Right.
One of the other things, did you think that the Russians, the Soviets, had invaded the British intelligence? There's a whole lot of stuff that they got all the word, and not only was it this one way, it was a way of pushing to the British, and the Americans believed the British because they were more knowledgeable, all of the bad things that Chiang Kai-shek and everything else did.
Well, I'm going to leave the Roosevelt question alone. I don't think he was a communist. I think he had a very strange soft spot for Stalin while being
an incredibly difficult negotiator with Churchill and the British, which is a really odd sort of
They'd
circumstance.
like to call Stalin Uncle Joe.
Yeah, and he wanted Stalin to like him. It's all true. About the British, quite interesting. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see, I didn't talk about it today, but there's a very eerie and powerful parallel to what the Americans basically do in China with what Britain does in Yugoslavia, with the abandonment, of course, of Mihailovich and the Chetniks. And this has really gotten me in hot water with some British readers because effectively it impugns parts of the Churchill legend. And you know, Churchill got some things right, he got some things wrong. He got Yugoslavia wrong, I'm sorry, there's no way around this. You know, the British abandoned their own client, that is effectively the commander of the armed forces of the government they're hosting in London was not simply abandoned by Churchill, they endorsed smears and lies against him for which he was later executed. He was rehabilitated by the Serbian government in 2015, that is Draha Mihailovic. And I've looked into the communications. There's also this, oh, Tito was this independent-minded figure and all the rest of it. I've seen the correspondence between Tito, Molotov, and Stalin. That too was a lie. Again, this talking point about Mihailovic's collaborators, a Soviet talking point, like the talking points about Chiang Kai-shek and his wife being corrupt and all this. You know, these are absolutely communist talking points inserted into the political bloodstream by Soviet agents and sympathizers. I mean, among other things you'll see in the book, Drew Pearson, famous Washington merry-go-round columnist, he had a nationally syndicated radio show listened to by millions. He had at least 3 communists working on his staff. And so he was repeating talking points one after another during the war, you know, about Poland being troublesome and quarrelsome and a thorn in the side of the alliance, whereas, of course, Stalin breaks off relations because the Polish government wants the Red Cross to investigate Katyń. So you've got Drew Pearson. Now, Hollywood, I actually wrote an article not long ago about this. I'm not going to talk about the mission to Moscow, which is almost too obvious, but try rewatching Casablanca sometime. And think about this a little bit. Why are there no Poles in Casablanca or Yugoslavs, the ones who were actually resisting, the ones who had actual armed resistance organizations? No. Instead, you have a Czechoslovakian with a Hungarian name, Laszlo. Huh? You've got Bulgarians? Oh, okay. I mean, I have a soft spot for Bulgarians. The Bulgarians were collaborating with Nazi Germany, as was Hungary. And then the strangest part about it is, like, you listen to the backstory about Rick and how he kind of had his heart broken and all the rest of it. You fought against the fascists in Spain. It's all Soviet anti-fascist communist propaganda talking points. So even at the end of the movie, I mean, when he kind of gets, he's converted to the cause, they throw the Vichy water, bottle, and, basically, he's reconverted now to anti-fascism.
All of Casablanca was fake, including Rick's Cafe.
Yeah, it's just, but it's effective. You have to give them credit for this. No, they did polls on this. By the end of the war, the American public had turned violently against Poland and was extremely pro-Soviet. It'll flip around a little bit, a few years later, but think about that propaganda. I mean, it worked. It worked. Not on everyone, but, it worked. So that increasingly, again, Stalin was Uncle Joe, and that's what they kind of turned him into.
Well,
Times Magazine Man of the Year, right?
Prop is truth, so I can tell you it is.
Sean, could you comment about Roosevelt's right-hand man who became
Harry Hopkins.
Harry Hopkins, about how he
Right, yeah, you're right. I didn't mention Hopkins today. So, I mean, he really is the driving force behind Lend-Lease. And I mean, he's literally living in the White House for most of the war in a Lincoln bedroom. So he's like the first person to see Roosevelt in the morning, usually last person at night. There's an interesting debate among espionage specialists as to whether he might be, I can't remember the number, Agent 59. There's some number, that is from the Benona decrypts, that is that he might have been. I'm a little agnostic on this. I see what he did. In the end, I think that what's more interesting than the question of whether or not someone specifically had a handler or was on the payroll, because a lot of these people are volunteers, remember, they don't have to be paid. I mean, Harry Dexter White, I don't think he was paid. He just reported regularly to Soviet intelligence because he believed in the cause. I don't think Harry Hopkins had a regular handler, and I don't think he was paid. I just think he was personally kind of fanatically devoted to the cause of the Soviet Union. He says this again and again. It's right there in his words. There's this one amazing quote after the war where I think Marshall said something like, yes, my job with the president was to represent the American interest. Hopkins' job was to represent the Soviet interest. There's a line at Tehran I discovered where, after everyone's putting all this heat on Churchill about opening up the Second Front Overlord in May, and Churchill wants to delay, he wants action in the Mediterranean. Roosevelt famously sides with Stalin, where Hopkins goes over to Churchill and he tells him not only that he can assure him that Roosevelt's made up his mind, but he said the Soviet view is equally adequate. Hopkins informing Churchill about what the Soviet view is. I mean, it's not like it was a secret what the Soviet view is, but the phrase is quite interesting. And again, he would give interviews. I discovered magazine interviews where he would almost boast about this, that everyone knew he was the greatest enthusiast for the Soviet cause in Washington. And he was proud of it. Again, part of this is because of his climate of opinion. It was not seen as a disreputable thing among the respectable set in Washington. Obviously, there were critics, but to some extent, and this all came out a few years ago, again, with all the controversy about America First, the rhetoric of the Trump administration, but going back to the America First movement, people forget it was a very mainstream movement until Pearl Harbor. I mean, there were people from all walks of life, all political persuasions, but to some extent, I think this happens in all wars, certain opinions got marginalized and, essentially declared out of bounds.
Did Roosevelt know that Pearl Harbor was going to be bombed?
That's a very good question. Again, I'm agnostic about the specific details of the attack, but I think they almost certainly knew that an attack was coming. And there are lots of books on this by people who are better informed than I am about information not being shared with Kimmel in Hawaii. And I've read some of these books and I've seen some of the documents. I can't say I have any kind of a definitive take.
We're going to have to wrap it up, and if you brought your book with you, bring it up to get it signed. If you would like to buy a book, we'll be over in the museum, in the library, $25, cheaper than you can get it on Amazon. Come on over and buy a book and get it signed.
My apologies for running over time. If you have any questions of the book signing, if you still have questions.